got my cue. Friends, on behalf of Center Congregational Church and Windham World Affairs Council, I welcome you to the annual Galbraith Lecture and Fundraiser. My name is Scott Cooper. I welcome you as the minister of Center Congregational Church. We hope while you are enlightened by the lecture that you will also enjoy excellent hospitality and fellowship while you are here. For your safety, I would like you to be well aware of the exits at the front of the sanctuary to my right and to my left, and also at the rear of the sanctuary. There's an exit there. For the two people in the balconies, I trust you won't have to knock anyone over to get out, but you have two exits up there to my right and to my left. Bathrooms are located on the main floor here and also on the bottom floor of the church. Simply exit through this door and make a right, and the two bathrooms are in the classroom block of the church. We made sure to disable the codes, so you should be able to get in there. But because the codes have been disabled, you may wish to knock first before entry, and maybe even lock the door behind you as you enter. Last but not least, in terms of announcements, I'd ask all of you to please disable the sound on your phones so that if you receive a call or a message during the presentation, that will not interrupt the proceedings. In addition to the minister at Center Church, I'm also the vice chair of the board of the Windham World Affairs Council, which was founded in 1961 to further understanding of important world issues, to encourage discussion, and to engage citizens in the foreign policy of the United States. Tonight's event honors one of our co-founders, John Kenneth Galbraith, a distinguished economist whose belief that economies should serve people and not the other way around. If this is your first time at a Windham World Affairs Council event, please talk to one of our board members, and I'm just going to ask if they can raise their hands. Please talk to one of our board members and ask us about joining as a member if you've not already done so. Our upcoming schedule includes a film and talk about the social justice origins of the song America the Beautiful at 118 Elliott on October 19th. It's a screening and conversation with the filmmakers of the documentary Borderline, The Line Within, about the massive surveillance and detention operations on the U.S. and Mexico border. That will be at the Latches Theater on October 26th. We also hold members and friends salons for informal discussions on world affairs and United States foreign policy. A final note before we get started is to thank our community partners, BCTV, Brooks Memorial Library, the Vermont Humanities Council, Vermont Independent Media, the Commons, Windham Wines, and World Learning and the School for International Training. These collaborations were thanks to the hard work of Susan Healy, our outreach coordinator. If you saw a flyer, read an announcement about this event, or had a bite of food in our parlor at our reception, Susan was responsible for all of it. and so much more. I now turn it over to tonight's moderator, Brattleboro's own John Underlider, Director of the Greater Falls Community Justice Center and a professor of peace, conflict, global issues, and restorative practices to teachers and students from all around the world. As professor at SIT, John started the Youth Peace Building and Leadership programs, which brought over 12,000 young leaders for dialogue about the conflicts they inherited. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Scott. Good evening. Again, we gather for a talk hosted by Windham World Affairs Council to assess the challenging issues of our day. I thought we might have solved a few by now, since when I saw Peter's father, John Kenneth Galbraith, speak up at SIT 3 decades ago and had the most famous economist of the time sign my infant son, Jacob's copy of One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish. I'm not sure he understood why. Now, unlike Ambassador Peter Galbraith, I've not been in the room where decisions are made, but rather worked in citizen diplomacy, peace building, and conflict transformation, building relations between former combatants or young members of communities in conflict. Almost 20 years ago, I asked Peter if he thought if we should host Iraqi teens for a peace camp, and went forward and he pointed out that he thought they would be safer in Vermont at the time. That program is actually still running, if not at SIT. Now I fear for the thousands of shining young leaders who came through SIT when it was still a campus, students from now failed states like Libya, Yemen, Somalia. We watch with horror the violent deconstruction of stunning, successful democratic movements by strongmen with weapons, as in Sudan, Ukraine, Burma, Hong Kong, states wrecked by legacies of dictators, Syria, Zimbabwe, Iraq, and fighting that should have long ago ended between Israel and Palestine. Broken states with corrupt leaders can stay broken for a long time, as Venezuela, where I taught before SIT, or Uganda, where I stay in touch with a dedicated young activist from a youth program decades ago. In each state, there are capable young leaders who believe in democracy, in each other, and in us. My flagship course at SIT was Conflict and Identity, and in summer peace camps we would get young Israelis and Palestinians, Greek and Turkish Cypriots, Catholic and Protestant Northern Irish, Indians and Pakistanis, Sunnis and Shias, Kurds and Arabs from Iraq to speak together more readily than we can get red-blue dialogue here today, dug in our silos of ideology. And what will happen here? What of LA, Chicago, Portland, DC, of lost legal rights and process we thought were sacrosanct in our country, of our sycophantic Congress, cabinet, and court. From yesterday's reformer, I quote, "The Windham World Affairs Council recently signed an open letter to reject the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, entitled Countering Domestic Terrorism and Political Violence, which directs federal agencies to use joint terrorism task forces to investigate and prosecute U.S. nonprofit organizations and foundations from doing nonviolent work in their communities at home, which will stifle important debate and discussion by civic organizations." So let me drop this ball for now and turn these range of crises over to our seasoned ambassador from Newfane, to bring his experience working for the U.S. and with other governments, to share wisdom gained working in conflict-challenged countries like Croatia and Iraq. We hope his advice proves useful for each of us in facing the current forces against democracy. We only have 1 hour, a 30-minute talk plus 20 minutes of question and answer, and I know everyone has a lot to say, so let's focus and be concise. I'll review, we'll do one question only. So thank you for joining us, Ambassador Peter Galbraith, but we're supposed to first get a welcome from Robert Reich, who was John Kenneth Galbraith was his mentor.
Hi, I'm Robert Reich, and I wish I could be with you right now in beautiful Brattleboro, Vermont. But Hey, I live here on the left coast. I was going to say west coast. It's actually the left coast, which means I miss the fall colors, but I don't miss the winter cold. I am so pleased that you at the Windham World Affairs Council continue to hold an annual Galbraith lecture in honor of my friend and mentor, John Kenneth Galbraith, whose family, I understand, still has a summer house in Newfane. And I very much appreciate that Peter is with you today. Peter, hello. No one has influenced my thinking and sense of what a public life could be more than Ken Galbraith. You see, Ken didn't regard economics as a form of applied mathematics. He understood it as embedded in politics, sociology, history, and moral philosophy. Above all, he was fascinated by power, who had it, how they used it, how it was countered by others. As some of you recall, Ken was an imposing presence, lanky and angular at 6 feet 8 inches. Well, I'm 4'10". The height gap between Ken and me didn't matter much when we were dining together, but vertical conversations, say walking along the streets of Cambridge, they were always challenging. Our average height was 5'9", but average, that was irrelevant. You see, when the distribution of anything becomes widely disparate, talk of averages can be misleading. So it has been with American incomes. Although the average American income is now much higher than it was when Ken and I walked the streets of Cambridge in the 1980s. That's not true of the typical American's income, which, adjusted for inflation, has barely budged. Most economic gains have gone to the top. America has the most unequal distribution of income and wealth among all advanced nations. And inequality is increasing further and faster here than in any comparable nation, which may have something to do with why our democracy is in the crisis it is in. Because as Ken understood, you can't separate economics from politics. But I'll leave the rest of that to Peter, or Peter, whatever you want to talk about today. Thanks, all of you, for doing this, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Secretary Reich. Is this on? Now?
Come over
Is
here.
it on now? Okay, is this?
Come
Can you
over
hear
here
me?
if you want.
All right, well, if you can't hear me, raise your hand. You know, in the old days, people used to give speeches from these podiums without the benefit of electronic enhancement. It's on now?
You're tall.
Okay, all right. Reverend, thank you for making this wonderful church available. It's a pleasure to be back here. I hesitate to say among old friends, but longtime friends. And particularly remember being here giving a speech after a very tough time in Afghanistan and the support that this community gave me at that time in 2009. I'm also really admiring of the Windham World Affairs Council, which, as you may not know, is by far the smallest World Affairs Council in the United States. It's really quite extraordinary that a county the size of our county should have a World Affairs Council. No other county in Vermont has it. There's just the Vermont World Affairs Council. And it is the function of how vibrant and, dare I say, enlightened our community is. To John you talked about your work bringing people together, and I was struck by your reference, well, to many communities, but to Indians and Pakistanis, and thinking back to Christmas and New Year's 1971, when at our home in Townsend, we had a classmate of mine at Harvard whose father had gone in that year from being in prison to being just a few days before president of Pakistan. And the other guest was the daughter of the Indian Foreign Secretary. And this is December of 1971, 2 weeks before India and Pakistan had fought a war that had led to the independence of Bangladesh and Pakistan losing more than half its population, literally being cut in two. And I have to tell you that we were all students at Harvard, and it was up to me and my brother to kind of try to provoke an argument, shall we say, between these two young women. They got along very well, so we were unsuccessful. But the point is that the dialogue there that Benazir Bhutto, who later became Prime Minister of Pakistan, had with her Indian friends at Harvard and at Oxford, shaped her worldview, and in fact, I was with her in her living room the night she was elected Prime Minister, November 16th, 1988, and we flew down to Karachi together, and before I went on to India, I wrote out a letter from her to Rajiv Gandhi on a yellow pad. She copied it in her own hand, and I delivered it to Rajiv Gandhi, then the Prime Minister of India, and they met a couple of weeks later. Actually, the pictures looked almost like a wedding couple, and it was an opportunity to improve relations between the two countries, and things might have gone quite differently if she hadn't been overthrown in a coup and then Rajiv Gandhi later assassinated. And just a word about Bob Reich. After my father died, he was getting an honorary degree at Berkeley, and he wanted some momentum for my father. So my father had gotten an honorary degree from Berkeley, and he had his gowns. So I gave him the gowns. And you can imagine the academic gowns of somebody who was 6'8½" and somebody 4'10". Anyhow, let me just begin by saying I was asked what I wanted to talk about, and I tried to think, and I chose the topic of hotspots around the world because there's so many of them. And so this is going to be a more diffuse discussion, and I hope we can have questions and answers and respond to your interests than my usual lectures here, which have typically focused on one place: Balkans, Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine. And this is only some of the hot spots, as John referred to. There's Somalia and a conflict between Somalia and Somaliland, Ethiopia and Egypt, Sudan, the perennial conflicts between India and Pakistan. And one thing I'm not going to discuss, but happy to respond to in the questions and answers, is China, the U.S. Relations, and China and Taiwan. Neither is an active hotspot. I hope neither will be, and I also have kind of unconventional views about China. I don't subscribe to the idea that it has to be a rival or adversary, which is so popular in the national security establishment, which is often just looking for an enemy. But I'll be happy to talk about it in the Q&A. But I am going to talk about three or four areas. And some of these hot spots are happenstance. They're a confluence of mostly unrelated events. The biggest of these, in terms of global consequence and casualties, is, of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a war that is now in its third year. Then, of course, there's the Hamas 2023, October 7th, so we're at the second anniversary, attack on Israel and the massacre of over 1,250 people, including kids, at a music festival. and 250 hostages, and then the subsequent Israeli response, which has taken maybe 60 to 70,000 lives. Related to that is Israel's destruction of the Hezbollah leadership in Lebanon, and somewhat related is the war earlier this year between Israel and Iran, which involved the United States. Then there's the big change that took place in Syria, and that's a country I've been going to maybe 2 or 3 times a year since 2014. I've been going to the northeast, so the part that was controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish-led group that the United States has been backing. But in Syria, you then had the fall of the Assad regime after I guess close to 50 years, father and son. The coming of power of the HTS, which is an organization whose leadership comes from Al-Qaeda and ISIS, now embraced by the United States. And then the internal conflict among the Druze, the Alawites, the Kurds, and the HTS. And finally, just to make a point, so often Americans, when we look at the world, we think it's all about us. And so either we're responsible for all the good things, if you take one point of view, or as maybe somewhat more common in our part of Vermont, we're responsible for all the bad things. But the truth is, it isn't all about us. And what may be more relevant is that over this decade, over this century, the United States has simply become less relevant. And it was very striking for me as ambassador to Croatia during the war, and therefore dealing with the war both in Croatia and in Bosnia in the 1990s, and later actually in East Timor. The United States was the indisputed superpower, the only one. Sometimes when I spoke, I hope I won't be thought of as heretical in this church, but sometimes I'd speak, I almost felt like I was channeling the voice of God, because nobody dared say no. They wouldn't necessarily do what was being asked, but they usually would not dare say no. This was a time when China had not yet risen, the Soviet Union had disappeared, and Russia had a smaller economy than the Netherlands. So it was an extraordinary moment that was always going to change. Russia was not always going to stay down. China was going to continue to rise. India was and has become a more important factor. Europe couldn't get its act together to deal with the crisis in Croatia and Bosnia in the 90s. But Europe is getting its act together. So America's unique position in the world that we had at that moment in time was not going to continue. But in this century, we have done extraordinary things to undermine America's influence in the world and to make it maybe irrelevant to a number of these situations. So first, I'm going to talk about Ukraine. And there are many lessons from Ukraine. But I want to just start by making a point of what an extraordinary miscalculation Putin made in February of 2022. He assumed that Kiev would fall easily. I think it's not entirely clear what his ambitions are. My belief is that what he really wanted to do was to not recreate the Soviet Union, but to create a larger Russian Federation among the Russian peoples. And in his mind, both the Belarusians and the Ukrainians are Russian people. That there is no Ukrainian nation, he says. It's basically Ukrainian is kind of a dialect of Russians, and of course the leadership in Belarus basically takes the view that, similar to Putin's, that they are a Russian people. This is something that Putin has been articulating, And this is one of the lessons in international relations, that the first victim of propaganda is almost always the propagandist. And so he believed that Ukrainians were really Russians, that this illegitimate regime would collapse, and they would be taking Kiev, and the whole thing would be over in a matter of weeks. And that gets to the second fallacy that is so well illustrated in this conflict and in so many others, which is that your military is most powerful on the day before you use it. Undoubtedly, the Russian military told them there would be no problem. They believed it. The end result has been a war of attrition of catastrophic scale, and something so much reminiscent of what we saw at the beginning of in the second decade of the 20th century, not in the 21st century. They're not entirely reliable statistics, but in Ukraine, the estimate is about 57,000 people killed in a population of 40 million, 250,000 wounded. For the Russia, 700,000 killed or wounded, 133,000 killed by name, and that's out of a population of 143 million. If you want to look at the Russian casualties and compare them, and this is in a short period of time, to American casualties in the Vietnam War, it's 4 times as many in a much shorter, relative to population, in a much shorter period of time. What's also interesting, actually, I didn't focus on it until recently, is that the civilian casualties are about 14,000, and almost all of those are in Ukraine. And given the scale of the conflict, although a lot of attention is focused on drone attacks, and missile attacks, that's a relatively small number, for this conflict. So it's really falling among who? Among the young men who are mostly drafted to fight in this war, and that has consequences. The other feature of this conflict, which makes it very significant to the world, is the way in which warfare has been transformed by the use of drones. And what are drones? Of course, they're pilotless aircraft that can deliver weapons, but in fact, they are very inexpensive. They can be mass-produced, and they basically take away the advantage that countries have with very expensive weaponry, like, say, the $700 billion a year that we spend in this country. As the Russians discovered, a small number of drones using artificial intelligence hidden inside a truck parked in Siberia can take out aircraft that costs hundreds of millions of dollars. And you think about what it could do in this country. They can fly undetected over military fields. They can take out, some of our aircraft are $250 million each, and that could possibly be taken out and destroyed by a drone that might cost $2,000 or $3,000. So it is very significantly changing the nature of warfare. And you want to imagine how this could happen. What could happen in the Ukraine war? Well, you had Russian drones, apparently off a tanker, flying over airfields in the airport in Copenhagen. So the airport was shut down. Well, think about how inexpensive it would be to shut down all the airports in Europe using a small number of drones, or even in this country. So we tend to think about weapons, bigger the bang, but these kinds of weapons, it's entirely different. And they're now using artificial intelligence so that you don't, because a drone that's controlled by this computer is capable of being jammed. But a drone can use artificial intelligence to identify what its targets are going to be. Like all wars, they have unintended consequences, and it's rarely that you have a good result. Now, what are the prospects for this war? And let's see if, yes, I just show a slide, which basically, the blue shows the advances that the Russians made at the beginning, including getting close to Kiev. Then they're pushed back, and it's a fairly static front. In the last year, the Russians have made some advances at great cost on the battlefield, but it is a reasonably static front. And are there any prospects for peace? Well, the current president of the United States said he would end the war on day one. I think we're about 200 days into his administration, and it isn't over. He has tried, the White House has floated, or put forward, not floated, the idea that Ukraine should surrender territory. But the reality is that no Ukrainian leader can surrender territory or is going to agree to that. The U.S. mediation, there was an embarrassing summit in Alaska when Putin came. Trump said he was going to get a ceasefire. He didn't. He did agree with Putin on the idea of Ukraine giving up territory, but in fact, there's been no progress toward ending the war. Now, there is the question of which side is the United States on? Europe is clearly on the side of Ukraine, and the United States had, under the Biden administration, been the largest supporter of Ukraine, a couple $100 billion. Incidentally, of course, that sounds like a lot of money, but if you compare it to the $4 trillion for Iraq or the $3 trillion for Afghanistan, total costs included, it's really very small. And with zero American casualties, zero Americans on the ground, as compared to those wars. And frankly, I would argue that there's much more at stake. Now, what is at stake? What to me, I'm not persuaded, as I said earlier, that the Russians are, if they take Ukraine, that they're then going to attack, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. That's going to be World War III. I think that, in fact, Putin's ambitions are, as I said, to have a larger Russia Federation to include these Russian peoples. And he's not going to achieve that. So if the Trump plan were to go forward and Ukraine were to give up territory, basically Crimea and the territory that you see in the east, you would have it's not an achievable agreement, but beyond that, you would have done great damage to the most fundamental principle that has kept the peace in basically the lifetime of all of us here since 1945. And that is the principle that once you're a member of the United Nations, for all the ineffectiveness of the organization, the fact that it exists, you're a member of the United Nations, which means you're an internationally recognized state, and there's no dispute about your borders. Those two conditions are true. No country can attack you for the purpose of annexing territory. Yes, there are wars like the Soviet one in Afghanistan or the American one in Afghanistan or the various American wars against Iraq or Vietnam, but none of those were about invading for the purpose of annexing territory. The only attempt that was made since 1945 was Saddam Hussein, who invaded Kuwait in August 2nd, 1990, declared it to be Iraq's 19th province, and that ended very badly for Saddam. So it affirmed the principle. So, at least to my mind, there's a lot at stake in Ukraine, which goes to the cornerstone of this agreement. Now, the U.S. lack of resolve on Ukraine raises issues about another cornerstone of the post-war system, which is NATO. NATO had been reasonably unified on Ukraine. Okay, there was Hungary, which was a little out of step. But now to have the United States either ambivalent on the Russian side is a major split, probably the most serious crisis that NATO has ever faced. But it also, you have a president who says that he doesn't believe in NATO, and particularly he doesn't believe in Article 5 of the NATO treaty, North Atlantic Treaty. What does that say? Article 5 says if one country is attacked, if an attack on one member of the alliance is an attack on all of them. And the purpose of that is not to draw everybody into a war, but to deter an attack on any of NATO member, because the attacker has to calculate that the attacker will then be at risk with all the members. Well, Trump has basically said, I'm not sure I'll stick by Article 5. And then there's a second issue that affects NATO, which I'll just touch on briefly, but which I wonder about, which is Greenland. Trump has repeatedly said, and this goes back to his first term, that he wants Greenland, and if Denmark won't sell it to the United States would take it. Now, lots of people, including foreign policy types, say, he's not serious. But I have one lesson from a rather long career in diplomacy, which is this. What a leader says he's going to do is the most reliable prediction of what a leader is going to do. In my days in dealing with Croatia and Bosnia, and this was the number one issue that the Clinton White House was focused on, we spent hundreds of millions of dollars on, well, they didn't have email then, but on intercepting phone calls. Am I disclosing secrets? Oh, well. Hundreds of millions of dollars on, intercepting the phone calls of the leaders, or we would have agents. This is hypothetical. A secretary in the defense minister's office who, might hand you some memo or something. Why? What did we want to know? Well, we didn't want to know how many aircraft or anything they had, because we knew that. That you can collect from satellites or aircraft. We wanted to know how they were going to use that equipment. What were they going to do? But, all that intel, it was always much better what the defense minister told me they intended to do. That was or the president. So I think you have to take Trump seriously when he talks about seizing Greenland. And I also think there's a context here, which is if Putin gets his, Crimea, the Donetsk, will Trump want to get his, which is Greenland? And then how would Russia react to that? I think Putin would be thrilled, because he knows that a U.S. attack on a NATO member would be the end of the NATO alliance. Second issue I want to talk about, and I'm mindful of time, so just keep me reasonably on time, but Bob Reich talked for a very long time, is Syria. And this is something really not related to anything the U.S. did. But after 50 years, the Assad regime collapsed like a house of cards. And I was there in Syria meeting with the head of the Syrian Kurds on November 28th. And I said to him, General Mazloum, you know that Assad regime, it's a house of cards. He said, really, Ambassador? I said, yeah, it's just one push and it's going to collapse. He said, I'm going to talk to those guys in Idlib and tell them that. And, the next day they launched the offensive and it was over in 10 days. Okay, just joking. But I was with him on November 28th, and we had no idea that that was going to happen. The next day, the offensive began, and the thing did collapse. By early December, they were in Damascus. And immediately, Ahmed al-Shara, who's declared himself to be the president, has been embraced by the United States and by Europe, without actually a lot of people asking who he is and who are the people around him. This was Al-Qaeda. This was the Islamic State. These were people who engaged in acts of unspeakable brutality. They were the people who kidnapped young Yazidi girls, and both Sarah and I have been very involved in this. Held them as slaves, raped them repeatedly. The justice minister that Shara appointed, he's replaced him, is on video executing 2 women in Idlib who he accused of being prostitutes and shooting them on the street. So it is a regime of questionable, staffed by people of questionable character. I actually think that Shara himself probably has made a transformation, but I think a lot of people around him haven't. But more importantly, what Shara is doing in Syria is trying to create a unitary Syria in a country that is a very diverse country. About between 35% and 45% of Syria's population are not Sunni Arabs. They are Alawites. That was the Islamic sect that the Assads belonged to, about 12% of the population. Yes, we're on there, along the coast. The Druze, which is I'm not even sure you would describe them as Muslim, but anyhow, one of these minority religions in the Middle East. The Kurds, who control the eastern part of the country, more or less everything east of the Euphrates River. And all of these groups have very different approaches. They are not interested in having a Sunni Islamic state applying Sunni Sharia law on them. Not the Alawites, because they're a very different sect, not the Druze. And the Kurds, yes, well, most of them are Muslim, but are Sunni Muslim. But in fact, this is the extraordinary influence of Vermont on Kurds. Now, I'm not talking about myself, although you may know my history. It's a fellow named Murray Bookchin. Anybody know who he is? So what's the story of Murray Bookchin? Well, he was in, the 1950s, like Bernie Sanders, grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and was part of the Young Communists, handed out protests against McCarthy and so on. And then in the 60s, he came up to Vermont as part of the Back to the Land movement. And then he went back to Columbia, got his PhD in philosophy, and was teaching at some college in New Jersey when the seismic event took place in Vermont. You, of course, know what I mean, March 2nd, 1980. Bernie Sanders is elected a socialist mayor of Burlington by 10 votes. So Murray Bookchin comes to Burlington, and he, of course, being two leftists, he and Bernie immediately fall out with each other because, think Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. And anyhow, he goes ahead and he devises this philosophy based on radical environmentalism, strict gender equality, and a form of government at the lowest level based on the ideas of Vermont Town Meeting. And his book is translated in a number of languages, including Turkish. Meanwhile, in 1989, 91, they go back in history, 1984, Abdullah Öcalan founds the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, in Turkey. And he makes it a Marxist-Leninist party, and he models himself on Stalin, including the mustache and the ruthlessness. But 1989, 1991, Marxist-Leninism has gone out of fashion. Berlin Wall falls, all of that. And then in 99, Öcalan is captured by Turkish commandos with the help of the Mossad and probably the CIA in Kenya as he leaves the Greek ambassador's residence. And he becomes the only prisoner in Imrali Island in the Sea of Marmara. And guess what? If you're the only prisoner, you have a lot of time to read. And somebody gave him a copy of Murray Bookchin's book. And Murray Bookchin's philosophy has been applied by the PKK in Turkey and in northeast Syria. So if you go there, there are their legislatures, equal number of men and women, co-prime ministers of each of their cantons, co-presidents of the region, each a man and a woman. Half the generals are women. They're women fighters. There's a television station entirely run by women, from the management to the security guards and all the reporters. Well, I say all this because you have to ask the question, how does that, which has been going on since 2012, mesh with an Islamic State? And I've been involved in trying to help the Syrian Kurds, but also the Alawites and Druze in figuring all this out. And of course, you have to end up with a very decentralized statement or a federal state, so that up in the northwest of Syria, Idlib, yeah, if they want to apply Sharia law, that's fine. In the Kurdish areas, they're going to have Bookchinism. Vermont. I'm not joking. This is really true. And and then the Christians can do their thing, and the Alawites can get some protection, because since Shah took office, there have been 2 huge massacres, one of the Alawites on the coast, thousands killed, and one of the Druze in Suwaida on the border with Israel. I know I'm going on a little bit, so I will just touch on one further thing, which is Gaza, and say a word about that. The first point I'd make is, when Hamas attacked Israel 2 years ago to the day, they knew full well what the Israeli response would be. So you could ask, why did they do it? Well, they had a number of ambitions. They were rivals with the Palestinian Authority, so by doing it, they imagined that they would be the leading party within the Palestinian cause. Second, on August 6, 2023, the Israel-Palestine issue was a 4th-tier issue in the Middle East. And people were focused on Iran, Iraq, Syria, and the Palestine-Israel issue was way down there in terms of anybody paying attention. Well, they made it page 1 and a 1st-tier issue. Their hope was to inflame Palestinian opinion against Israel, Arab opinion, Muslim opinion. And in fact, they succeeded on all these points beyond their wildest dreams. In fact, the Israeli response, again, they knew entirely what it would be to transform Western opinion so that we have countries like Canada, Britain, recognize a Palestinian state. You have in the United States, when I first went to work for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Democrats were absolutely solid in their support of Israel, no matter what. The Republicans were a little ambivalent. There were the evangelicals, the Jesse Helmses of this world, who were just anti-Semite, and then there were the country club Republicans who didn't really want to have Jews in their country club. But the Democrats were solid. Now you have a situation where the Democratic Party is, increasingly moving away from Israel in terms of support. It is a catastrophic, and even elements of the Republican Party, significant elements of the American Jewish population. So this is a catastrophic setback for Israel, a strategic setback. And did Hamas care about the civilian casualties? No. I'm sorry, but if you run a martyrdom cult, and that's what Hamas is, all those casualties are not, an acceptable price. So where are we now? Well, it's very hard to see a war ending by a negotiated peace. But, and that's the issue in Ukraine. There's just no basis by which Putin or Zelensky can agree to a peace. Zelensky can't give up territory, no successor can, and Putin can't admit that what he did was a failure, although the one hope there is that a successor Russian government will turn against the war, as they did in Afghanistan, as the U.S. did in Afghanistan. I mean, so if it's not on your territory, you can give it up. But in the case of Hamas, the situation basically is that Hamas and the Palestinians in Gaza have been destroyed. And now there is a peace plan that has been designed by the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, embraced by Trump, and then helped by a kind of fortuitous event, which was the Israeli failed attempt to assassinate Hamas leaders in Doha, in Qatar. And why was that? And that infuriated Trump, whose family, of course, had business interests there. But the Qataris are also playing a mediation role, and you remember they gave him an airplane. So at this point, Trump has made clear to Netanyahu that he has to choose between American support and accepting the Blair plan, but of course now the Trump plan, or the right wing in his coalition. I mean, he's already right wing, but the far right, where he risks losing support, and if his government falls, he risks going to jail. But basically, it appears to be a choice that he does not have, and so the Israelis have accepted the plan, and it looks like Hamas also, because they've been destroyed, will accept it. A final point, and my father always said, John Kenneth Galbraith, that when you give a talk, you've got to say finally or in conclusion a number of times because it gives your audience hope. But the final thing I'm going to say is how much the Palestinian radicals and the Israeli radicals have in common. In fact, they both want from the river to the sea. The PLO charter originally spoke of a single state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean for Jews and Palestinians. And this is also the program, it was the explicit program of Likud, and it basically is the program of the Israeli right. So we talk about the two-state solution. Of course, I think that's a correct solution. I think it's unlikely. What was a one-state solution going to look like? Because I think it's quite likely that with Trump administration support, after Israel accepts because Israel has accepted the peace plan, and if Hamas does, then Israel will annex the West Bank. All right, what are the, and of course, they're not going to allow the population to vote. But sooner or later, there's going to be a left-wing government in Israel because single parties don't stay in power forever. We know in Vermont, because we used to be a solidly Republican state. And when the left wins, with support from the 2.1 million Palestinians or Arabs in Israel, what are those 2.1 million Arabs going to demand as the price of their support for the left-wing coalition? They're going to demand that the vote be extended, the ballot be extended to Arabs, Palestinians who live in the West Bank. So you have 2.1 million Palestinians in Israel proper, 3.4 million in the West Bank. That's 5.5 million. If the annexation is of Gaza, that would be another 2 million. And what is the total population, Jewish population of Israel? Well, in Israel proper, it's 7.4 million and another 450,000 in the West Bank. In short, the river to the sea is a program, the one-state solution is a program for a state that the Palestinians envisioned, it is the people who may be the biggest losers of all that are the people who want a greater Israel. I will conclude by saying that just in 1984, I made my first trip to Israel, and I had lunch with Abba Eban, who had been the foreign minister, British guy who came to Israel. And he said to me, Israel can be two of the following three things. It can be a democracy, it can have Judea and Samaria, and it can be a Jewish state. It can be two of the three, it can't be all three. And I think that is true today as it was then. So, thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if this is on. I'm not sure this is on, but well, I hope some of your questions were already answered by Ambassador Galbraith, but we'll take a few questions, and please just one question in the languages that he talked about, wahid, one, or yek in Kurdish, or yadan in Croatian. Echad. So just one question, and if you need to set it up, please be concise, and we'll try to go for another 15 minutes and get as many as we can. And yeah, go ahead. And I don't know if you have the mic. No, I got the mic.
Mr. Galbraith, do you think that the Palestinians are truly a second-degree kind of being, and that they don't deserve what all human beings deserve in this world, which is to live in freedom and to be able to clothe their children and earn a living? What on earth are you talking about when you're suggesting that it looks as though the only thing you care about is to somehow make Israel stronger? Israel, you said that Netanyahu...
Yes, you did. Can you wrap up?
Okay, I will wrap it up by saying, as you pointed out, when someone says, I'm going to do something, believe them. Netanyahu is absolutely intent on destroying Gaza, and I believe him. Tell me what you think the solution is to Palestinian having statehood.
Well, just to be clear, I was not describing, when I was describing Mr. Netanyahu's views, I was not describing Peter Galbraith's views. I find Netanyahu to be a repulsive character. I find what Israel has done in Gaza to constitute crimes against humanity, massive war crimes, and the United Nations has judged it to be genocide, or at least the report of the United Nations. So I'm not for that. I don't defend that. And I don't see how you could possibly have gotten that from anything that I said. In fact, I take offense at that thought. What do I think? I think the correct solution is two states. Do I think that's, but I'm not, what I say in the Congregational Church in Brattleboro, Vermont, much as I wish it would go forth and change the world, it's not. I'm describing the situation as I see it likely to develop. And as I see it likely to develop, Netanyahu Hamas launched an operation that accomplished a lot of their goals. But in the end, it's led to the destruction of Gaza, and it is going to open the door to Israel's annexation of the West Bank, which is something that the right in Israel wants, and that Trump is basically supportive of, and the ambassador there, Mike Huckabee, is strongly supportive of. And my point is that if that happens, be careful for what you wish, because ultimately, I believe that the politics in Israel will eventually favor the left. I don't know when that will be, but nobody stays in power forever. And if they do, they will extend the vote to the Arabs, because that will be more votes for the left, and that will be the end of Israel as a Jewish state. That's how I see it happening. Do I think that's the best result? No. I think the best result would be a two-state solution. But I don't think the United States is for that. I don't think the Israelis are for that. Hamas is not for that. So where are we? That's just, but that's an analysis. It's not an advocacy of any point of view. So why don't we go there?
Yeah, this is a question for either one of you, and perhaps a little bit more for Professor Ungerleider. One of the comparisons that I've seen made a lot is the resolution of the Troubles in Northern Ireland via the Good Friday Agreement, and people have made the comparison of that to the situation in Israel and Palestine. And I'm wondering if you think that is a logical comparison, if there's something to be learned there, or if it's misguided. Thanks.
Well, I'll be brief, and then I'll hand it back. Yeah, I was actually there when that was happening, and of course Cyprus would be like that too. And I think when there's not, those things are possible when there's not a war going on. And I think all those things are possible, and there are a lot of Israelis and Palestinians that do get along and do communicate, and they can live together in the same thing. And there has to be a moment when things can move, but that's not during a war, and it's probably not right after a war. Ambassador?
Yeah, look, I agree with John's assessment. I also will say, I think one has to be very careful about making comparisons. I've seen time and time again where, when we took over Iraq, we were looking at the what we did during the occupations of Germany and Japan. Might have done a lot better to have studied about Sunnis and Shiites. They came to me to want to know what we had done in Bosnia, and they took one of the lessons that might have been relevant to Bosnia, which was to delay elections because they thought it would lead to more nationalists prevailing. Well, when the Iraqi elections were finally had, the Kurds vote 100% for Kurdish nationalist parties, the Shia for Shia parties. So you have to be careful about any analogies. But the person who's the real architect of the Good Friday Agreement is, of course, nominally it's Blair, but it was Jonathan Powell, his chief of staff. And Jonathan is now the National Security Advisor to Keir Starmer. Do I think that there's a process of mediation and negotiation that might work? Do I think that the plan that Blair has come up with, the 21 points, is as good a plan as you can get? Yeah, I do. But remember, there are a lot of things that are not in that plan. I taught at the National War College, and there's always a thought, well, if we have our military, we can go grab it. Well, that turns out not to be as easy as it sounds. But when you're in diplomacy, you never get 100% in a negotiation. I mean, that's just how it is. We're also at the 30th anniversary of the Dayton Peace Accords, and in my head, I always remember what President Izetbegovic said when he initialed that agreement in Dayton on November 21st, 1995. He said, and it was true, he said, this is an unjust agreement, but it is better than the continuation of the war. And also, things change. When there is no war, the situation can evolve, including as it did in Northern Ireland.
Is that right? You had a question with the plaid there.
First of all, thanks for a great presentation, both of you. Really, really informative. Oh, sorry. One quick question about Ukraine. Do you envision a scenario deep in the future, or maybe hopefully soon, where Ukraine would be asked to or allowed to join NATO after the conflict ends? Thanks again for your presentations.
I think one of the most irresponsible things that the George W. Bush administration did was to open the door to the admission of Ukraine and Georgia to NATO. Why? Because there was no way that 2/3 of the U.S. Senate or the other, 20 members of NATO were going to approve the admission of a country that was in the case of Georgia, had part of its territory occupied by Russian proxies, or of Ukraine. And so, you know, in an ideal world, would I have said yes, admit them and protect them? Fine, but we don't live in an ideal world, and it was basically a poke in the eye. Now, I don't think that was the reason for the invasion, but certainly it was a factor. So yes, I think the easiest thing in the world as part of a peace agreement would be to agree that Ukraine is neutral, like Austria. You know, Austria was also under a four-party occupation, like Germany, and it was agreed that would be unified. Vienna would be unified, but it would be neutral. And I think the same story could and should apply to Ukraine. But that probably is not enough for Putin. So I think the best we can hope for the time being is a frozen conflict. And instead of full-scale war.
There.
In the corner. Yeah. This is on. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I think you touched briefly on Iran and the U.S. Involvement in the recent conflict. There are two things I wanted to ask, quick two-part question. The first one was what you thought of the President of the United States directing parts of that conflict from his social media channel, and at the end saying, "Good job, everyone, conflict over." And then where do you think that leaves us, since we now know that everything wasn't obliterated and destroyed, and Iran is still on track?
Well, first, I'm chairman of the board of the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. That's actually better sounding than what my job really is, but which is just a chair board a couple of meetings a year. But I have been very involved in the non-proliferation issue, and I can tell you I'm not an enthusiast of non-proliferation by bombing. Because generally it's ineffective. And what happened here was the United States used bunker buster bombs on 3 Iranian facilities. The Defense Intelligence Agency did an analysis, and they assessed that it had set back Iran's nuclear program by months. And Trump said, "We've obliterated it." And so what did they do? They fired the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency for having provided an honest assessment. So I guess we're going to have great successes if we simply say that whatever we wanted to happen, happened. We had no hurricanes this year. Well, here's the other, we saw the same story. Didn't like the inflation news, fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. What is that? So I will say about Iran, and I've been there, and talked to people in Tehran and the Iranian Foreign Ministry. First, I would say there's no reason for a conflict between the United States and Iran. It actually has entirely to do with domestic politics in Iran and domestic politics in the United States. When the hardliners in Iran are attacking the United States, they don't care about the United States. They're attacking their domestic foes. And when the Republicans in this Congress were attacking President Obama over the Iran nuclear deal, they weren't attacking, they weren't concerned about the nuclear deal. They wanted to stick it to Obama. When Trump got rid of the nuclear deal, it had nothing to do with, Iran was following the nuclear deal, but he wanted to undo a success of his predecessor for whatever psychological reasons that are beyond my scope here. But though that's the dynamic of both of those countries. But if you step back, you say how much in common they have. Iran is a rich and diverse culture. Its people, in the entire time I was there, I never met a single person who believed in the system. And I had the same experience spending 11 weeks in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union as a teenager in 1968, driving around camping. And I spoke Russian at the time, being back there in 1971. I met many communists. I never met anybody who believed in communism. And what I can tell you is, and there are many people who are in the system in Iran, but there's almost nobody who believes in it. And when the belief goes, sooner or later the system's going to go. Nobody believed in communism after the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. 21 years and the system fell. So I think it's the same way, but the one thing that prompts up the system is American hostility. I think that the Iranians and the President Pezeshkian would like to have a deal. Actually, here's one thing I think can be said in favor of Trump, and you can tell I'm not an admirer. But I think he'd like a deal. And so maybe there's a possibility there. I certainly hope so.
Okay, we'll just do two more. Lissa, and I think the woman behind Skylar there wanted to go. Lissa.
And I want to take this gentleman here because I don't want him to think I'm afraid of taking his question, provided it's a question.
Well, I think we're going to go back to the similar.
Okay. Well, it's okay. We'll go ahead and I'll be. Go ahead.
Up to you.
I'd like you to pick up on the theme of Iran a little bit, but in reference to Saudi Arabia, because when you're talking about nuclear capabilities, that's something that the Saudis are very interested in developing and have been very close to deals to actually securing a nuclear weapon, as far as I can understand, with the help of the United States. What is this relationship, if you could expand upon, between the Saudis and Iran, and specifically also if you could mention your views on why the Hamas attack was timed the way it was in terms of the deal that the Saudis were making with Israel just before the attack, and how much that attack might have been an attack against the Saudis as well as the Israelis.
Well, let me just say about, I actually worry more about a Saudi nuclear weapon than I do about an Iranian one. And I invite you to consider the leader of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, who to me reminds me a lot of Saddam Hussein. And I followed Saddam Hussein's activities closely at a time when the U.S. was embracing Saddam. So what has Mohammed bin Salman done? Well, he sees a yacht in the Mediterranean while he's in Monaco or someplace. He sends somebody out to buy the thing for $540 million. He buys a painting that might be by Da Vinci for $500 million. He locks up the Saudi royal family, the larger Saudi royal family in the Ritz-Carlton, and shakes them down for hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. He invites the Prime Minister of Lebanon to Riyadh, arrests him, detains him, threatens him. The Prime Minister resigns and goes back to Lebanon and unresigns. He's launched this incredibly brutal war in Yemen that has taken hundreds of thousands of lives. And then, of course, there was the murder of a minor dissident. I mean, nobody who was really any great trouble for him. Wrote a couple of articles in the Washington Post, Adnan Khashoggi, in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, something that was listened to in every detail by Turkish intelligence that then leaked it. So what do you have? You have somebody who is brutal and reckless, because so many of these things are just straight out reckless. And that pretty much describes the career of Saddam Hussein. So, I don't want to see the Saudis having nuclear weapons. As to the timing of the Hamas attack, I don't think that it was sophisticated enough to be about blocking Saudi Arabia from joining the Abraham Accords. I think it had, this was something long planned, as we know, and really had to do with the factors that I cited, and not you don't go in and massacre 1,250 people to stop a normalization between Israel and Riyadh.
So John, John and I don't know your name back there. This is John.
Well, I think I take offense by your saying that the conflict between Palestine and Israel was on the decline.
I didn't say that. So look, I'm not going to. First, I'm not going to engage in who's offended by what, but I did not say that. What I said was it had become a fourth-tier issue. It was on the back burner. Now, I don't see how that can be offensive to you. It is simply a statement of fact. In the Middle East,
it was on the back burner maybe for the United States and for the Western countries, but not a back burner for the Palestinian people who have been fighting for 100 years.
Of course not. Of course not. Yes, point well taken. It was not a back burner issue for the Palestinians. Is there a question you have?
My question, no, I just wanted to comment on your
Okay,
talk.
well, thank you for the comment. I can assure you that, and incidentally, the Palestinians are not the only people who have been oppressed. What about the Kurds? There are 7 million Palestinians. There are 60 million Kurds, maybe 50 million, subject to genocide. Did any Arab leader speak out? Did any Palestinian leader speak out? No. I mean, yes, I think what's going on is appalling, and I've made clear. But when I described it as a fourth-tier issue, at the time, that's what it was internationally, obviously not for the Palestinians. Where would I rank the issue of Somaliland? Probably most people don't know anything about it. But if you're in Somaliland, it's a first-tier issue. If you're in Derby Line, Vermont, what the Kirsty Noem did was a first-tier issue. I don't want to compare the suffering of people of Palestine to that, but my comments here were simply about international issues and how they were seen. But of course, to the people who are experiencing these things all over the world in Darfur, if you're a Darfuri, that is a top-tier issue. If you're Druze in Sueda, being attacked by the Shara government, that's the top-tier issue. If you're a Uyghur, yeah, sure. There are lots of, if you're a kid at the music festival on October 7th, that's a top-tier issue, is what happened to you. If you're a hostage or your family, that's a top-tier issue. So when I used it, I didn't mean to denigrate the suffering of the Palestinian people. I simply meant to describe where it stood internationally. And now it's page 1 of the news.
Thank you.
Please.
Last question here.
Looking at where our country is now, I just want to draw off of both of your knowledge historically. When you see leaders come into power who are ignoring the Constitution of the country or the courts, do you see examples of those leaders being removed or leaving power from within the country, or does it take outside power to get them out of there?
Yeah, well, I would just say I think we might need election monitors from other countries, but Ambassador.
Unfortunately, I don't think the election monitors would make any sense. I'll make a couple of comments. Of course, I could talk for another 2 hours about that. But when I was the ambassador to Croatia, I was the first U.S. ambassador, and Croatia had just emerged from communism, and President Tudjman had certain authoritarian tendencies. So part of my job was to talk about democracy, things like a nonpartisan, independent judiciary, not using the judicial process to go after your enemies, accepting the results of elections because, hey, there are going to be future elections. I wouldn't do that today. I would be embarrassed to do that. And this has been a long time coming in the United States. We have a partisan judiciary. No serious person believes that the 5 Republican Supreme Court members who stopped the Florida recount in 2000 would have done so had Gore been ahead of Bush. Well, the test of a judge is same law, same facts, same results. Biden, he went too far when he tried to give student debt, forgive student debt for hundreds of thousands or millions of students or people who had college debt, and yet Trump can ignore the appropriations process. I mean, where are we? The prosecution of Comey, incidentally, as somebody who wanted Hillary Clinton to win in 2016, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of glad to see James Comey go to jail for what he did, but no, I'm not actually, because it's a total abuse of the judicial process. This is what's been what's going on. So the question is, will we get out of it? I don't know. Well, there's no outside power that's going to intervene, but will we get out of it? I don't know. Will the Marjorie Taylor Greene has talked about a national divorce. Well, will that happen? Do we have enough in common? I think that is a huge question. So I hope we do. I hope we continue to have elections, but what happens if people don't like the results of the elections? I mean, look what's going on now. Arizona just had a congressional election. The Democratic candidate won. It was a Democratic seat. And they're refusing to swear her in. I mean, it's unfathomable. And, there's Donald Trump. But there are all the others who who has placed power over country. I worked for the Senate for 14 years. I can't say that being a member of Congress is such a wonderful job that I would want to ruin the country, especially if the Congress doesn't do anything. And what about our other institutions, universities, law firms, the media, the Washington Post, CBS? This is a really dangerous time internally, and it, of course, affects America's standing in the world. Sorry, but I could go on, but I'll get off the soapbox.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Galbraith. Well, thank you, and thank you to the audience for getting him fired up and talking, and maybe he'll stay after and speak for a few minutes. So thank you for the analysis.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the wonderful Windham World Affairs Council and to this wonderful friends here